Chapter 10. Defending against a cordon search. The Soviets preferred large cordon and search operations to deal with large zones of Mujahideen-dominated territory. They would cordon off the area using dominant terrain, roads, and rivers as boundaries. Then they would push forces through the area looking for weapons, stores, and Mujahideen. The Soviets often used DRA forces to do the actual searching. The DRA usually combined taxation and press gang conscription with the search. At first, the Mujahideen were vulnerable to these large-scale operations, but then they learned to build fortifications throughout the zones, coordinate their defense, constitute a reserve, and exact a toll on the searchers. Vignette 1. Battle of Baraki Barak by Commander Qazi Guijan Tayyib. Baraki Barak district is a very fertile oasis and a major green zone located between the two main highways running south and southwest from Kabul. One highway runs from Kabul to Gardez in Paktia province, and the other runs from Kabul to Ghazni and on to Kandahar. The waters of the Wardak River and Wardak Gorge irrigate this fertile area, and wheat, corn, and rice fields interspersed with vineyards and orchards. This fertile, well-populated valley provides a natural base from which the Mujahideen could attack both of these main LOCs, as well at Mohammed Aga district to the north and Gardez in the south. In June 1982, there were several Mujahideen bases located in the Baraki Barak district. We had brought a number of heavy anti-aircraft machine guns into the area, particularly the ZGU-1 14.5mm single-barrel machine gun. The enemy was concerned about the presence of these air defense weapons. We received information that the enemy was preparing an offensive into our area with three major objectives. First, to seize our air defense weapons that were becoming a hindrance to their air raids in our AO. Second, to capture some of the leading Mujahideen commanders who continuously harassed and attacked Soviet and DRA columns traveling on the two highways which bordered our area. And third, to seize control of the area and restore the district government to the DRA. We had overthrown the DRA district government in 1979. The Soviets and DRA launched their offensive with more than 20,000 troops involved directly and in support, map 10-1 Barak. They sent out three columns, one each from Gardez, Kabul, and Wardak. These forces moved to our area, established a cordon around it, occupied the high ground, and began attacking some of the Mujahideen positions. The column from Kabul occupied Pul-e-Alam, and from there sent one detachment to the west around Mir Abdal mountain to flank the district from the northwest. The column from Gardez moved west of the road to the Altamur Plain and covered the southeastern access to the district. The column from Wardak occupied positions on the district's western flank. The enemy blocked practically all major axes out of the area. Since we Mujahideen commanders knew of the upcoming offensive, we'd gathered earlier to draw up a joint defensive plan. All faction commanders participated, and we constituted the southeastern and northwestern defensive sectors and assigned defensive areas within these sectors to different factions and units. We organized our forces into small groups to ensure our ability to maneuver and then occupy positions in the perimeter villages of our district. We constituted mobile interior reserves and kept them available to react to enemy actions. I commanded the southeastern sector. I had approximately 800 Mujahideen, armed and unarmed, under my command. Our weapons included ZGU-1s, Dishkas, mini RPG-7s, PK machine guns, 82mm mortars, 82mm and 75mm recoilless rifles, machine guns, and a number of .303 bolt-action Enfield rifles. These Enfields were quite effective against dismounted Soviets. They had a maximum effective range of 800 meters compared to 400 meters for the AK assault rifle. Further, the more powerful .303 round would penetrate Soviet flak jackets, while the AK round would not. The enemy deployed his artillery on the Altamur Plain at Pul-e-Alam. His column from Wardak occupied the line Dashti-Delawar, Chelton Hill, and the northern villages to the high ground. The enemy initiated their attack with heavy artillery fire and airstrikes on the villages and suspected Mujahideen positions. The artillery fire continued for several hours. They hit the positions of the ZGU-1s and set the entire area on fire. The enemy advanced from the southwest between Chaltan and the road and entered our villages and searched them. They also attacked from the other directions against the perimeter villages that they were facing. The Mujahideen fought them from their forward positions and fell back to backup positions as the enemy entered the villages. The villages and orchard provided good cover and concealment, and although the enemy had the area surrounded, we were able to move freely within the 10-kilometer wide area. We began to launch small group counterattacks with our scattered groups of Mujahideen. We hit the enemy from many directions. We suffered casualties, but the enemy also got a bloody nose. It was an infantry fight at close quarters. 3 Mujahideen in my immediate group were killed during our local counterattack. Soviet forces were encircled, and the Soviets launched counterattacks to aid their encircled forces. We also reinforced our troops. Our forces were intermingled, and the Soviet artillery was unable to fire into the area of contact for fear of hitting their own troops. Fighting continued until dusk. As night fell, fighting slackened and stopped. The next morning, the enemy resumed the attack, but this time from the east using tanks and infantry. We Mujahideen had mined the Khalifa Sahib Ziriat approach. The Soviets brought dogs to detect the mines. My group in this area were in well-covered positions with 3 RPGs. As the enemy cleared the minefield and moved forward, we opened fire with our RPGs on their tanks, standing in the open cultivated areas. The enemy responded by moving overwhelming force into the area. The Mujahideen responded by moving out of their positions to move through gaps to attack the enemy on the flanks. Small groups of Mujahideen with RPGs also maneuvered through the concealing terrain folds to engage the enemy. This totally changed the situation, with the enemy stopping and going to ground in defensive pockets. The enemy's momentum was lost as his attack bogged down. The Soviets occupied villages, farm buildings, and orchards and turned them into defensive positions as the second night fell. The Soviets were scattered in 5 or 6 pockets, and the Mujahideen kept them from linking up. We Mujahideen knew the terrain, and the local civilians helped us move from position to position. We attacked the Soviets from all sides, but suffered casualties as well. For the next day and night, the situation continued. Both sides were intermingled, and the whole area was on fire. We saw guns capable of firing in every direction, D-30, and saw a single-barreled grenade launcher, RPG-18. This was the first time we captured AK-74 assault rifles. Flak jackets protected the Soviets from AK fire, but our old 303s penetrated them. After 3 days and nights, the enemy began to withdraw. Every column returned by the direction it had come. None of the enemy's 3 objectives were achieved, but our losses were very heavy, with about 250 KU. The enemy spread rumors that they killed more than 2,000 of us. I don't know what the enemy losses were, but we saw blood trails and blood pools all over the former enemy positions. The enemy had done very hateful things in the villages they occupied. They defecated in the crockery, smashing pots and furniture, and destroyed villagers' food by cutting open sacks of wheat, flour, salt, and sugar and pouring it out on the ground. They also pulled down walls, broke doors, and ruined houses. Commentary. The Soviets and DRA thoroughly planned this operation. The converging movement of 3 columns from 3 directions was a desirable operational maneuver since it left the initiative in the Soviets' hands and kept the Mujahideen off balance. However, once the Soviet DRA force entered the green zone, the terrain and Mujahideen active defense split the communist force into a series of isolated pockets which the Mujahideen were able to contain. The Soviet DRA force lost the momentum of the attack and were unable to regain it. The initiative passed to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen planned their defense thoroughly. They conducted an active defense which incorporated tactical maneuver. They maintained a central reserve and had the advantage of interior lines. Terrain, well-constructed, field fortifications, and an aggressive defense enabled the Mujahideen to split the Soviet DRA forces into isolated groups and stop their advance. The Soviets and DRA did little to win the hearts and minds of the populace outside of the areas they controlled. On the other hand, Mujahideen activity often endangered the lives and property of the populace. During the course of the war, the Soviets never controlled Baraki-Barak, but they bombed and shelled it continually. Farming was disrupted and most of the population migrated to Pakistan or the cities. Vignette 2. Defending against an offensive in Paghman by Saronwal Sher Habib. In August 1982, the Soviet DRA forces launched a search and destroy operation against Mujahideen bases in Paghman. There were two enemy columns. The main column moved southwest from Kabul and then turned northwest onto the main highway to Paghman. Its mission was to destroy resistance bases in the center, south, and southwest of the Paghman area. The other, smaller column moved north from Kabul and then turned northwest. Its mission was to block Mujahideen escape routes along the northeastern edge of Paghman through Gaza and Zarshak villages, map 10-2 Gaza. Initially, the movement of the two columns in opposite directions deceived the Mujahideen as to their enemy's real intention. Nevertheless, when the Mujahideen saw the main column heading toward the city of Paghman and its western and southern suburbs, they quickly occupied prepared defensive positions and readied themselves for battle. However, the Mujahideen lost track of the northernmost column. It came through the town of Kara-Zemir and moved undetected to take up positions on the hills between Samachak and Gaza. From the hill positions, the enemy column commanded the main road from Paghman to the Shamali plain north of Kabul. The next morning, I dispatched two escorts to take one of my wounded Mujahideen to Shamali for treatment. As they moved through the Samachak Valley, they were ambushed and the escorts were killed. The local Mujahideen from Samachak village went to investigate and discovered that Soviet troops had occupied the ridge overlooking the village. The Samachak Mujahideen attacked the ridge, but the Soviets were too strong to be overrun. Other Mujahideen in the area began to discover the enemy presence. Mujahideen in the village bases of Kali Hakim and Ishakal, and in the valley base of Dari Zargar, joined together. I took some 30 or 40 Mujahideen into the high ground at Loy Bagal Gar. The Somachak Mujahideen reinforced their positions near the village. The Zarshak and Gaza Mujahideen moved to cut the LOC of the Soviet force east of the Turgandawi Hills. We had encircled the Soviet force in the northeast sector with about 100 Mujahideen. The fighting went on against the DRA Soviet forces throughout Paghman. We kept the northern Soviet blocking force pinned down, exchanging fire with the Soviet troops for 2 nights and 3 days. We commanders met and decided to attack and eliminate the Soviet force on the afternoon of the 3rd day. We launched the attack from the west while the eastern Mujahideen contained the enemy. Our progress was slow, however, since we did not have enough support weapons. We had Kalashnikovs, 303 Enfields, a few RPG-7s, and some 60mm mortars with a small stock of ammunition. We needed heavy machine guns, 82mm mortars, and rockets. As we Mujahideen were closing to the Soviet positions, some 14 Soviet helicopters, including gunships, arrived over the battlefield and began gun runs against us. We sustained heavy casualties and broke off the attack. The transport helicopters landed and began lifting off the Soviet troops and flew them away to Kabul. We had won the fight, but we suffered 23 KIA and many others WIA in the 3-day battle. Commentary. The Soviet DRA force did an effective job initially in disguising their objective and managing to move their northern column while eluding Mujahideen surveillance. The northern column effectively performed a surprise approach march and quietly occupied necessary terrain. The northern column was organized to block Mujahideen escape routes and so was lightly equipped. It was battalion-sized or smaller. It seized and occupied its initial position, but made no effort to expand that position so that it could achieve its objective of completely blocking Mujahideen escape routes. Further, once it disclosed its presence by firing on the litter party, it made no attempt to seize the initiative but remained passively in the defense. Coordination between the northern column and the main column was lacking since the main column seemed unable or uninterested in aiding the northern column despite their close proximity. The Mujahideen reaction was excellent. They quickly took up positions on commanding high ground overlooking the Soviet positions and sealed the area, trapping the Soviet force. However, the Mujahideen lacked long-range heavy weapons, so they could not exploit the advantage that their dominant terrain gave them. The Soviets were in range of the bulk of Mujahideen weapons only during the Mujahideen assault. The Soviet helicopter strike effectively countered this assault. Soviet helicopter gunships were not as effective at night. Perhaps the Mujahideen assault would have been a better chance if the attack were launched at dusk or before dawn. Mujahideen use of the battlefield maneuver was commendable. They offset much of their disadvantage in firepower, took dominant terrain and attack positions, seized the initiative from the Soviets by trapping them, and forced the Soviets to stage a rescue by hazarding helicopters. All of this was due to effective Mujahideen maneuver. If the Mujahideen had some anti-aircraft weapons, they could have bloodied the Soviet force badly. As it was, Mujahideen maneuver prevented the success of the Soviet DRA offensive and decided the outcome of the battle in the Mujahideen's favor.